So once again, a reminder, we're going to be walking around with cards. So if you have any questions for our esteemed panelists, please put them on a card. We'll be collecting them. There'll be people who are around that can bring them up to me, and I will use them as we get to the Q&A of this. So this discussion is diplomacy in an era of trade tensions. And we have a really great panel. We should be very, very pleased to have such esteemed people here. Former Ambassador of the United States of America to China, Senator Max Baucus, Ambassador Baucus, great to have you here. Thank you. He was appointed under Barack Obama. Sitting over there is Joshua Cooper Ramo. He's the co-CEO of Kissinger Associates. His bio is not in the program, so I'm going to read a little bit of it in just a bit, but also Ambassador Zhou Wenzhong, who is the former Secretary General of the Boao Forum for Asia and Ambassador Extraordinaire to the United States. Good to have you here. And let me tell you a little bit more about Josh, co-CEO of Kissinger Associates. You've heard of Henry Kissinger, I know all that. He had an international bestseller called The Age of the Unthinkable. He's based in Beijing and New York. He's on the board of directors of Starbucks and FedEx. He speaks Mandarin. I heard him upstairs chatting away. Who has been called one of China's leading foreign-born scholars by the World Economic Forum. And he's best known for coining and articulating the phrase, the Beijing Consensus, among other writings on China. So this is going to be a good discussion. Let's get started with something very, very basic. I think both of you heard my comments or all of you heard my comments at the top about what is the state of U.S.-China relations. Ambassador Zhou, what do you think is the state of U.S.-China relations at the moment?
Look, next year will be the 40th anniversary of the normalization of U.S.-China relations. And looking back, I think we have come a long way. And both sides have worked very hard for this relationship. And I think I have every reason. Maybe I think people down there would agree that we have every reason to make sure that this relationship will continue to make a progress. And so, what is important here is that I hope people here will have a right perception of China. So I will, after they talk about their views about current state of U.S.-China relations, I want to follow that up.
Ambassador Baucus, we used to refer to this relationship as cooperating rivals. I'm not sure that that's the phrase a lot of people would use right now. What's the state of this, what is now a very competitive relationship?
I don't think it's very good, frankly, the relationship. It's interesting that Josh is here. When I went over to Beijing, I first sat down with Dr. Kissinger to get his thoughts, and he gave me a couple of things to think about. Second, I picked up this book on China, read that, which essentially became my Bible. He talks about different concepts, Western, Eastern, chess, Wei Qi, for example. And second, he talks a bit about the Thucydides trap. And one thing that very much struck me is he mentioned in that book about the British Foreign Service tasking a British Foreign Service officer named Crowe in 1907 to write a memorandum for the British Foreign Service about Germany. What's the future of Germany? That was his task. And he looked at Germany, he came back, and he said, Germany can say they're the most cooperative, the most appreciative country that want to work with Europe. They can say all the right things. It's all irrelevant, totally irrelevant. What is relevant? Mr. Crowe asked. Essentially, two factors. One, Germany is a very large country. Second, it's a military power. Those two factors alone will determine Germany's future in Europe and determine the course of Europe over the next 20, 30, 40, 60, 80 years. And of course, that's what happened. Dr. Kissinger asked the same question about China. Rising power, established power. Pointing out many times in history, usually it doesn't work out too well when a rising power collides with established power.
That's the Thucydides trap.
Thucydides,
I always struggle to pronounce.
That's the Thucydides trap mentioned by Thucydides. Anyway, Anyway, Dr. Kissinger doesn't answer the question with respect to China. And it was a central question I kept asking the Chinese over and over and over and over again, privately. And as a side, I very much agree with Hank Paulson, who said that the Chinese respect candor. Not so much being embarrassed publicly, but privately. And the question I always asked was, what do we think, we Americans? You know, your GDP is doubling every 10 years. Your GDP is going to exceed that of the United States in 20, 30 years, maybe sooner. Your population is clearly already 4 times the size of ours. Your military spending is going up as doubling every 6, 7 years. What are we to think? What's the trend line? And not only what are we to think based on what you say, much more importantly, what you do. Actions speak much louder than words. So what are we to think? What are your actions to indicate to us that you want to work with us, the United States and other Western countries? And what we see are actions that aren't very encouraging. South China Sea, for example, protectionism for U.S. companies, for example, Xinjiang, for example, civil repression, for example. We don't see things that are really terribly cooperative. Now, there are some areas where we have cooperated. Climate change, for example, President Xi with President Obama was a good start, although this country now has backed off. Second, we cooperated in many other areas, you know, North Korea, Iran, sanctions, et cetera. Global health is another area. But add it all up, frankly, I am quite concerned that we're going the wrong way, that as the two tectonic plates shift, we're coming together, they're not going to mesh, they're grinding, and what's it going to take to separate it? And essentially the problem is this. You mentioned correctly the cover story of Economist earlier. The Economist had another cover story about 5 months earlier, which I think is even more accurate. That cover story was entitled, How the West Got China Wrong.
Mm-hmm. I remember it, yeah.
And essentially, I think it captured something very significant. Namely, we Americans, with our Western Judeo-Christian ethic assumptions, our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, rule of law, independent judiciary, all assume that if we just keep working with China, all these interchanges, they're going to be, quote, more like us. That's an incorrect assumption. And it's incorrect, in my judgment, because our systems are so different. China's authoritarian, no rule of law to speak of, no independent judiciary to speak of, and it's ruled by Xi Jinping and by the party. And the party is everything. So when we Americans and other Westerners try to figure out what's fair, what's not fair, we are just dealing with incorrect assumptions, and we're just two ships passing in the night. So I'll get to the quick here. My judgment is we Americans really don't understand China. We don't spend enough time over there in a solid way. We think we do, but we don't. I'm just stunned. Since I've been back from Beijing, I go over 4 or 5 times a year to keep current, with the degree to which Americans are still naive and don't know as much about China, in my judgment, as we should, to get a solution here. What's the solution? We Americans have to develop a very solid, thoughtful, strategic plan toward China. We don't have a plan toward how to deal with China. In my experience over there, it's been very ad hoc. Something come up, South China Sea, whether the ship sail over there, it's ridiculous. It is totally reactive. It's totally ad hoc under all recent administrations. And President Trump is right when he talks about some of the problems that we have with China, namely in the competitive sphere, you know, IP theft, or just some more sanctions announced today, actually, against some companies.
And yet at the same time, the Dow's up 250 points because there's talk about some kind of potential trade deal. I just saw it go flash by on my phone. I can barely keep track.
I'm not really saying about that. I'll just finish by saying we need a strategic plan, figure out what we can deal with, what we can't deal with China, where we can agree, we can't agree, and where we can't agree, we got to be able to show, we're going to stand up and say, enough's enough. And I've got all kinds of ideas, don't have the time to talk about it here, but here's some ideas on how to deal with all of that. It's the old thing in life. It's mutual respect. If we've got to respect them, they got to respect us. And Chinese can smell strength, I think, better than anybody else in the world. And they can smell weakness better than anybody else in the world. So we have to be strong in the best sense of the term, the most fundamental, long-term sense of the term. And these tariffs are not the way to go at it, I don't think.
You're getting ahead of me.
And I'll stop talking here.
All right, we're going to get to that.
I got kind of exercise about this, and I just think that we're not on the right track as a way to get there.
Josh, what do you think of the current state of the relationship?
Well, I think I'll pick up, where Ambassador Baucus sort of was headed, which I think is making this very important point, which you mentioned earlier. I wrote this paper in 2004 called the Beijing Consensus, which was arguing as opposed to the Washington Consensus, which people may know as this model proposed by John Williamson in the 90s, that every country had to follow the same developmental path. Those of us who'd lived in China and been there thought that this idea that as China became more prosperous, they'd become more American or more congenial to American interests was probably unlikely. And I think there is a bit of a kind of moment of reckoning right now as people understand that that's the case. Having said that, we're really only seeing the relationship today sort of at a moment in time. And I think maybe the most useful thing we can do is try to kind of think about it in terms of where it might go and maybe provide a little bit of context. In terms of where it might go, it's worth just thinking as we think about diplomatic problems. And Ambassador Baucus was mentioning my boss, Dr. Kissinger. I mean, this is an extraordinary diplomatic opportunity. You have a rising power and an established power, and the intellectual model is that you often do have this sort of Thucydides trap collision that's a disaster.
But it inevitably leads to war, a rising power against
It does and it
power.
doesn't, actually. So I think it's very important, actually, to get into the historiography of that. So if you look at the idea of the Thucydides trap, both in Graham Allison's book and in other cases, in many cases it leads to war. In many cases it doesn't. And it's not an inevitability that what we're going through right now is going to produce. So a lot of the analogy a lot of people use is a rising Germany and established Great Britain at the beginning of the last century. There are tremendous differences, which if you want we can get into, between that situation and our situation today. In fact, if you look at the Thucydides trap literature and the studies on it, it shows you that if the power gradient is particularly large, meaning the established power is much stronger than the rising power, they usually find some way to work together. The point is that that is a possible outcome. But our responsibility really has to be to try to find another outcome, because war between the United States and China, or continued conflict even between the United States and China, which stops us from finding areas of common interest we can work on together, really does present a much deeper cost than we may want to pay. And that's maybe the second point I want to make. So I remember I was having tea a number of years ago with Dr. Kissinger and a famous Chinese diplomat named Huang Hua, who was a vice premier and served as ambassador to the United Nations. And the two of them got into a discussion about the difference of foreign policy making between the United States and China, the West and the Chinese. And Huang Hua made an interesting point, which is Chinese begin their foreign policy analysis with a question. What is the nature of the age? It's sort of like when you get up in the morning, what's the weather outside before you decide what to wear? And Americans often get very focused on specific issues. Get rid of Saddam or fix the currency thing and don't think about that larger context. So I think it's of use to consider what is the larger context of the nature of the age we're living in. We are living at the beginning of a tremendously revolutionary period in human history, a period that may ultimately be as revolutionary and disruptive as the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were, as a result of the spread of technology, of networks of connectivity. Changes everything. Changes economics, changes military affairs, changes even the nature of human cognition as AI starts to come into play. One of the results of the last great shift of humanity, which occurred, really at the beginning of starting with the Reformation and then working its way through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, was a long series of wars as nations struggled to adjust to the demands of modernity. The world that we're entering into now, as all of us see all around us all the time, is one where all of our institutions are challenged, where a whole new set of problems are emerging. And our goal has got to be to find a way to get the United States and China aligned on a set of fundamental values that transcend these individual competitive dynamics that we have today. And so I think when you're asking sort of, what's the state of the relationship today, it's fine to say, look, today it's not where I think anybody would like it to be. But the question is, can we begin to imagine, maybe over the course of this panel, we can lay out what an alternative vision might look like and how we might work towards that, as opposed to getting trapped into this Cold War thinking of saying this is a new Cold War. One of the things we suffer from a lot in the world of foreign policy is this idea of what's known as the availability heuristic, right? You just take the earliest, the model that comes to mind. So people would say Afghanistan is the new Vietnam, right? Afghanistan was nothing like Vietnam. And saying this is a new Cold War, this is a new example of the Thucydides trap, really limits your ability to think about the dynamics that are at play here.
So you brought up this whole issue of the new Cold War. I'm interested in what you think, Ambassador Zhou, of Mike Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute, which is now being described as something that ushered in a new Cold War.
Could I respond to the remarks made previously?
Sure.
Yeah. I think the problem right now, I think, is the perception on the part of the United States of China has gone wrong. From our point of view, China is a developing country. And although China is the second largest economy, but China ranks 71st in terms of GDP in per capita terms. And China still has 30 million people who live below the poverty line, which is 3,000 Chinese currency RMB per year, every year. And China needs to add 15 million urban jobs every year. China has about 90 million people with disabilities. So China's focus is peaceful development. China has a lot of problems which it confronts with, which it needs to resolve, to focus. So China's focus, I think, is peaceful development, and the problems it has to resolve at home. So I think there are two things it will not change. One is, China's direction of pursuing a market-oriented reform will remain unchanged. Secondly, China's resolve to expand its opening will not change. But China needs a peaceful international environment to accomplish, those targets. And another point I would like to make is the world is changing very rapidly, which is becoming more and more interdependent. And also, so every country, all the countries need to work together because the problems are enormous, and no one country can tackle these problems just by itself. So I think the countries in the world need to learn how to work together and how to make sure that the interdependent world would continue to enjoy peace.
What do you think of Ambassador Baucus describing China as authoritarian and having no rule of law?
I don't agree with that at all. Because if it's some 40 years since we have started our reform program. If you compare China today with what it used to be 40 years ago, I think all fair-minded people would agree great changes have taken place. And another point I would like to make is that countries are in different stages of development. And so the kind of development, the pattern needs to be inclusive. In other words, China needs to develop in a context which is consistent with Chinese conditions. And I think that's the right of every country. No, there shouldn't be one model for everyone. So I hope you would not apply, sort of a certain abstract standard to other countries.
You said China's committed to market-oriented reforms, but a lot of people in the United States, I think in Western Europe, even Australia now, think that commitment to free markets and market reform has actually slid recently. That under Xi Jinping, there's a regression, so to speak, more involvement of the state-owned enterprises, more subsidies, more state control of the economy. It doesn't look like China is moving inevitably towards more markets in its economy.
Yeah, it's true that there will always be room for improvement. And at the Boao Forum, just last annual meeting of Boao Forum, which was held in April, Xi Jinping made a pledge, and he announced 10 measures which China will take in terms of opening still wider. And these measures are being implemented one after the other. So I think you will see the lifting of many foreign equity caps on things like automobiles, auto parts, and so forth. And the tariff has come down. And the tariff for automobiles has already come down from 25% to 15%. So I think things will move in that way, in that direction.
Everybody understand foreign equity caps. It's long been the policy that if you're going to invest in China, you've got to do it as a joint venture. You can only have a certain amount of equity, and the Chinese partner is going to have the controlling amount of equity, right? I mean, have I articulated that correctly? That's certainly been the custom, if not written policy.
22 sectors have been opened up. So you will see the lifting of the foreign capital equity will be lifted on 22 sectors. And as you mentioned earlier, the tariff on all the anti-cancer drugs have been lifted.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Baucus, what do you think when he says China's a developing country?
Well, it's interesting. One of our mutual friends, the former ambassador from China to the United States, who's now a state councilor, member of the Politburo, Yang Jiechi, said to me quite strongly that the Chinese, feel so superior to us as Americans. Why? Because they could not have developed in the last 40 years if they were a democracy. They'd be nowhere. And that China now is the model for developing countries worldwide. There's socialism, maybe with communist characteristics, maybe not. But still, their socialist form of government is a model for developing countries worldwide. You Americans, I mean, you can elect anybody president who might not be qualified, he'd point out. But here in China, all our leaders are peer-reviewed. They work their way up, Shanghai Party secretary, et cetera. So we got to figure out, kind of like Chicago backroom politics, kind of figure out who's good and who's not good. We select good people. You Americans, your system's terrible. It doesn't work. I'm reminded of a very interesting conversation between President Xi and President Obama during the first summit when President Obama was over there, at least when I was there. And President Xi was very concerned about Hong Kong. You could see the thorn in his side. You Americans, you're fomenting unrest in Hong Kong. You could tell it bothered him a lot. And President Obama basically responded by saying, well, DNA is in our, human rights is part of our DNA as Americans. Declaration of Independence, et cetera. And so members of Congress are going to stand up on the floor and be concerned about human rights. In fact, it's my DNA too, he said, President Obama. Then President Xi went on to say, it's quite lengthy, how the role of the party is to take care of the people. It even trumps human rights. And he went on to say that, that it's kind of like an emperor. Thousands of years of history in China, emperors survive or don't, depending upon whether the people are happy. And so the role of the party is to take care of the people. That's incomes, it's air and water pollution, it's health care, it's just taking care of the people. That's the Faustian bargain, and they're paranoid about it, and make sure they're, quote, taking care of the people so they can maintain power. And that's why there may be some rule of law, some independent judiciary, but ultimately it comes down to the party. What the party says is going to happen or not going to happen. I think that add to that all the thousands of years in Chinese history. It's a momentum building. I think many Chinese think the last 200 years is an aberration from the rightful place in human history. It's just things went off track a little bit.
People,
now it's going back.
In theory, they should already, for a long time, have been a much larger economy than the United States, right? They've got more people, they've got more resources, they've got more land masses.
Well, we all know what happened.
They're not.
We all know what happened in the 1800s and 1900s. They went the other direction.
Socialism, right?
It was during the Industrial Revolution too, over here too.
Mm-hmm.
That made a big
Well, what
difference.
happened? I think it is worth maybe talking about the history, because I think you're raising. So if you ask yourself, sort of, what is the fundamental defining moment of modern Chinese history? it definitely is the period of the Opium Wars in the 1840s. And what happened in the Opium Wars, just to do a quick history for folks who, you had an empire that had been around for thousands of years that saw itself really as the center of its universe, right? People know the Chinese word for China, Zhongguo, means the Middle Kingdom. And in the 1840s, the British showed up in southern China and said, look, we'd like to find a way to sell you our tea, and you created this, we need to buy your tea, and in exchange for that, we're going to sell you opium. And began selling opium into southern China. At that time, one of the Qing dynasty emperors thought this was not such a great idea and sent a famous bureaucrat down to southern China with this letter for Queen Victoria saying, look, if we showed up in England and we were selling opium to all your people, surely you'd be very unhappy about that and you'd tell us to leave. The British responded to that with military force, and within a matter of months, China's entire military had been wiped out. And that set off a period, the First Opium War, the Second Opium War, in which China was invaded by 9 different nations over a 75-year period. They lost a third of their population to internal struggles and to these wars. And you can imagine the cognitive shock. Think you're the center of the universe. Imagine if the United States in the next, found ourselves invaded by 9 different nations in the next 70 years, and what you would want to do and need to do to get out of that trap, and how deeply you would sort of feel that drive and desire. The Chinese problems with modernity, the question you exactly raised, which is, geez, they've got 1.5 billion people with a 70% savings rate. Why aren't they already a much bigger problem? Has to do with a set of problems that really, to make Ambassador Zhou's point, they are still a developing country. They missed modernity. They're, different in economics. We're at Chicago, so it's always great to quote Nobel Prize-winning economist Douglas North had this idea that the Industrial Revolution created these convergence clubs and divergence clubs, right? There were countries that became prosperous and urban and scientific, and there were those that missed it. And China completely missed it, and that's now what they're trying to catch up with. But when you deal with China today, one of the things you are dealing with is a country. The reason there's no rule of law is there were no laws for a long time. We don't have lawyers in China of the capacity we have in the United States. And so it is important as Americans, as we try to understand the reality of what we're dealing with in China, to really get the dynamics on the ground in a sense. And so I think there's a couple of elements. One is this deep sense of backwardness, of having missed the train, of never wanting, you were talking earlier, I thought you had a lot of very good questions about the China 2025 program. One of the lessons of the Opium Wars was, if you don't have the best technology in the world, you're totally vulnerable to whoever shows up. Whether or not China can actually achieve those goals in the 2025 plan, and I think most sophisticated people think they're an impossible set of goals, what drives it is that horrible national memory of this sense of national humiliation. I remember we were working on computer-related deals at one point over there, and many of the computer manufacturers thought, we'll go to China and we'll sell our oldest machines to the Chinese, because they're just grateful to have any computers. The Chinese wanted the most advanced machines. So that element of it, as well as one thing I feel that's missing for those of us who live and work in China in a lot of these conversations, is the incredible dynamism of this younger generation that's coming of age. In Chinese, we call them the Zhou and the Linglingho, the post-90s, post-2000 generation. We have in China today a very interesting company called ByteDance, which has a product called Toutiao, another product called TikTok, which is the highest valued private company in the world right now. It's surpassed Uber, it's surpassed Didi, and you feel this energy of consumption and power there.
So back to my original question to Ambassador Baucus was, I think to hear Ambassador Zhou say China's a developing nation sounds very cheeky to a lot of Americans.
But I think it's trying to understand that it's both.
Owned by the Chinese.
Yeah, so I think that's
the second largest economy in the world.
Yeah, so one of the problems we have is that you tend to look at it in a very black and white way. And the crazy thing, if you live in China, is you every day, I can tell you this, right, having lived there, full time for 12 years, is every day you experience China as a first world country and a third world country within an hour. And so understanding that tension, imagining the challenge of leading in that kind of environment for China's leaders, again, I don't feel like my job is to judge it as good or bad, it's just to try to understand the perspective they're coming from. So I don't think it's meant to be cheeky. I think it is really meant to express, particularly somebody like Xi Jinping, whose family comes from the poorest part of China, in Gansu and Shanxi, that there are a lot of people there who still are living the lives of people in a developing country.
So what do we do now in the wake of Vice President Mike Pence's speech, which has, you haven't addressed it directly. What did you think of that speech, Ambassador?
I was put out with it.
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
I was put out with Vice President Pence's remarks. I thought they caused a problem, exaggerated a problem, by saying publicly that China is infiltrating or hacking the U.S. election system. I don't have any information that says that's true. I think it's all rhetoric. I think it's part of the Trump administration's plan to get voters all whipped up, for the midterm elections and maybe 2020. It's political more than it is substantive. I was very put out. I'm very embarrassed to say that much of that speech is now published by the American Embassy website in Beijing, and that just inflames things. It's the wrong way to go about this, in my judgment. It's unfortunate. That again, it begs the question: what do we do? Right. If you want to get to that, we can. But I thought the speech was inadvisable.
Can I drill down a little bit more on that? So yes, the accusations that China was intervening in our elections was a new one, right? That a lot of people hadn't heard. But when he said tariffs, quotas, currency manipulation, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies doled out like candy, to name a few, there's actually a lot of consensus, both left and right, that a lot of those are actually real issues that American companies face. Do you dispute that?
Well, sure, there are issues, but the question is, how do you solve them? How do you solve them?
Okay, yes.
I'll try to speak more distinctly. No, for example, right now, China does not know who to trust. Is it Mnuchin? Is he calling the shots here? Is it Navarro? Is he calling the shots with respect to the trade issues? Even if it's one or the other, they know that Trump can undermine, whatever Mnuchin, as he did once, agreed to with Liu He. They're buffalo. They don't know what to do, and so much of this is in America's side of the court. That is, be more specific and stick with it. Don't keep changing your minds. A lot of the Chinese wonder, as I said, even if Trump says something, will Trump stick with it? That's a big issue. So the answer...
Everybody aware Treasury Secretary Mnuchin went to China, thought he came back with a deal. They're going to buy more soybeans.
Liu He came over, had a deal on tariff, on deficits, et cetera.
And then they thought they had a deal, and then
Trump
said, we don't have a deal.
No, pull the rug out. Right. And so Liu he's less likely to come over now because he doesn't want to be embarrassed again. So to answer your question, yeah, sure, there are issues. There are definite issues. But they got to be dealt with, I think, in a smarter way. All these tariffs are not a smart way to deal with it. Rather, target the issues. The indictments that came out today are a good example of targeted efforts to try to stop malfeasance.
You're talking specifically about some members of the Chinese military who have been indicted, one extradited from Belgium for trying to steal aerospace secrets from
There's
GE,
that, and also a couple others are indicted, indictments announced today.
Yeah.
Correct.
Josh,
that's more targeted.
Josh, I see you nodding your head. When
I think so much of what Ambassador Baucus is saying is exactly right, which is the way in which America approaches these engagements, the way we think about our discussions, has been challenging, frankly. I mean, I think these issues exist. I don't think there's anybody who would argue that you need a tremendous rebalancing of the relationship. But the question is, on what basis do you pursue that rebalancing? And I think if you consider it sort of from almost every level, from sort of a strategic level and an operational level and sort of the tactical level, there are probably things that could be done that would be more likely to lead to a solution. Almost everywhere you go today, what you hear from people is that America's biggest challenge, the biggest foreign policy challenge for the United States, is handling a rising China over the next 50 years. And I struggle a lot with that. It seems to me that the biggest challenge for the United States is the maintenance of international order that we've built and that has maintained our country and has put us in a position of global dominance. China is a piece of that. Russia's a piece of that. Artificial intelligence is a piece of that. But an overall strategic vision is to say, look, the international system is going through a period of a tremendous reset. What is the role of the United States in that system? And I think if we are in a position of commanding a vision of that system and executing on it, China becomes a part of that larger project for us. But I think this issue of just focusing on China has two problems. First of all, it removes our leverage. One of the lines when you're studying Chinese negotiation theory that you'll read, and for those of us who, this is our hobby on the weekends, we read studies of Chinese negotiation psychology, one of the lines that come up a lot is, Chinese often respond to persuasion, but they more often respond to manipulation. That when forces are aligned in such a way that there's no choice about how to move, that's the right way in which to handle things. And so I think creating an overall context which is consistent with our values, that then allows us to go to the Chinese with our allies and other people and say, this is the vision we have of this world as we go through this revolutionary time, is a much stronger basis on which to pursue our national interests, both from a negotiating standpoint as well as from kind of an American values standpoint.
Professor Zhou, you can't let these two Americans talk so much. We need more of you here.
Yeah.
So, what do you think of the Pence speech? I mean, I'm pretty sure it's obviously you didn't like it, but when he talks about forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies that benefit Chinese state-owned enterprises.
I think many people have pointed out, including the speakers, some of the speakers here. I think it's not factual, and it's not consistent with the current state of our relations, and some of the accusations are groundless, and so the timing is also very tricky because the speech was made when the Secretary of State was paying a visit to China. So I don't know, the coordination of, as far as the speech, the timing of the speech is concerned, is right.
We have guests on CNBC, CEOs, who say that absolutely forced technology transfer is an issue. You have to go in, as Hank Paulson said, by default, you're going to do a joint venture. If you're going to do a joint venture, you have to give this other Chinese company your technology.
Talking about technology transfer, in the beginning of the opening of China, that's part of the contract, because at that time China has no other resources than market. So if you want to have a market share, then the part of the agreement would be transfer the technology. But that's what happened earlier during the opening. It's no longer the situation. So if they have a specific complaint, I think they're welcome, because now we have formulated regulations, we have relevant laws concerning foreign investment. So I think there is no such sort of provision. So if there is sort of a complaint or specific case, so they're welcome to bring it to us.
I think we are all guilty always of thinking, the Chinese government, monolithic, controls every part of the chain. But, the complaint we hear is often at the regional level, or the regional politicians who are embarking on this kind of activity. And they don't feel, a lot of these companies, that they can actually get a fair hearing in a Chinese court.
And the fact that, the foreign investment is increasing. And I think the estimate for the foreign investment next 5 years would reach 600 billion US dollars. And China's outbound investment would reach 750 billion in the next 5 years. And China's import would be 8 trillion. So I think, China represents a big opportunity for other countries and for all the sort of commercial entities in other countries. So they are welcome to take advantage of this opportunity. So it will be two-way sort of, there will be investment going out, and there will also be investment going into China. And all these would be voluntary decisions. So the fact that they would like to go to China to make investment, that shows that they think this is worthwhile.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear everything you're saying, because, we have here almost consensus that there are issues about, your two co-panelists both said, yes, there are issues. Yes, there's, right? The Economist, which is considered a very mainstream magazine, says there are issues.
Yeah.
So I just don't know how we're ever going to bridge a gap when we can't even really define the problem, or we have such different views of the problem.
Yeah, there are issues. I think this is maybe this is the situation we're confronted with. There are problems, there are issues, but you shouldn't question this is a policy. Whether or not this is a policy, I think you shouldn't question that. It's certainly not the policy of the government.
For technology theft?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you have a specific case, or you have, the commercial entities have a commercial entity have a complaint, I think they are welcome to bring it to us. And I think the embassy or the consulates will take the complaint to the authorities in China, and should be dealt with according to law.
If I might, frankly, in a certain sense, this is easy. That is, Chinese people and American people have the same hopes, aspirations, and desires. What are they? Decent income, food at the table, take care of the kids, education, clean air, clean water, live a decent life. I mean, they're basically the same. And it seems to me that to add to that, we're together joined at the hip economically with the big trade we have between the United States and China, investment and in trade. China wants this thing to work out. That is the trade tension. We want it to work out. We people certainly do. And I think China is looking for a way to give in a little bit here and there, addressing some of the issues that we're discussing here. If they can find a way to do it and dealing with the United States. This comes down to trust. It all comes down to trust. The degree to which China can trust the United States and President Trump and vice versa. And that's just not there now. And it's not there because all the name calling back and forth. And my judgment's not there because we don't have a sufficient number of people in the United States to really understand China. Add to that, we don't have a strategic plan with respect to China. But it's one, with a new president, I hate to say that, it sounds a little political, with a new this president's not going to solve the problem. I think he's incapable of solving it. But with a new president, then we have an opportunity to
What is
start
the
to
problem?
No trust.
Okay.
No trust either way. Don't care rhetoric. I mean, I'm speaking from the American side. The American rhetoric about China, and we just need a new president.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, finish.
Agreement was reached. Liu He came to Washington twice, and in May, I think agreement was reached between the two sides regarding some of the problems, issues between the two countries. And again, in July, August, there were consensus and agreement regarding ways to resolve the problems. But then, they went back on their words. So then he decided to impose a tariff. Then we responded with the same approach. That's where we are.
I think a lot of it has to do also with the way that just as somebody who's spent nearly 20 years now working between the two cultures, a lot of it has to do with there's just different ways of going about approaching problems in a way when you have a problem. And it is really true generally that Chinese will begin with this kind of what is the overall nature of our relationship? Do I know you? And part of that's, by the way, because there's no court system in China. There's all these things that are still developing in China, but also for historical reasons, that the individual is only seen in the context of their relationship, right? So in China, the famous example of this is Chinese names, right? Where your family name comes first. So in the US, I'm Joshua Ramo. If it was in China, I'd be Ramo Joshua, because the most important thing about me isn't who I am, isn't that I'm Joshua, it's Ramo. It's that you're part of this larger historical context. And so Chinese always begin with this sort of, where does this person fit? Where does this idea fit? And Americans tend to begin with a very specific thing. It's the great thing about this country is we all came from nowhere. We had no background. We were all immigrants at some point. And we said, let's just get down to work. Let's not worry about this. Let's focus on these specific problems. And this kind of mismatch you see over and over in engagements, which is the Chinese will always say we want to begin with strategic understanding. We want to make sure, Xi Jinping comes over and he says we want, a 新兴大国关系, which is a new kind of U.S.-China relationship.
Show off.
New kind of great power relationships. And the Americans say, well, why are you doing the forced technology transfer? Why are you doing all this other sort of stuff? And so I think kind of it's incumbent on us as Americans, as we think through this problem, to try to take that step back. These are very serious issues that we're talking about. And as you point out, there is honest disagreement about what they mean. And I think there's some facts at which really there should not be very much disagreement. But the whole premise of the relationship all along has been, going back to the Shanghai Communique, that we would have areas of cooperation and we would have areas where we disagreed. And the aim was over time to make these areas of cooperation so large and flourishing and engaging and fill our university campuses. I mean, this wonderful story when Deng Xiaoping says to Jimmy Carter when they normalized relations in 1979, would it be possible for us to send some university students there? And Carter says, send 10,000 of them. And Deng says, what are you talking about? I thought you'd say 100. So that premise of let's build this cooperative thing and have the disagreements be in that context, that's a vision that we shouldn't lose. The disagreements are serious, they represent meaningful national security threats to both sides, but they're best managed in the context of cooperation.
Yeah, I guess, but it's so on display here. You just said there's no court system in China. He says, use the court system in China.
Well, but I think what Ambassador Zhou was saying, not to put words in Ambassador Zhou's
Right.
mouth, but the reality is the Chinese legal system, and all of us who have to deal with and understand this, is a work in progress, as ours was hundreds of years ago. The Chinese way of solving this, again, not to put words in the ambassador's mouth, but if you're domestically in China and you have a problem, for instance, with coal mining dumps or excess chemical discharges, because they do get caught up in this bureaucracy, is to create these special channels to handle things. Now, we can have a discussion about how well these special channels work, but it's not like Ambassador Zhou is trying. I certainly didn't understand him to come say, please bring this to trial in China. I think what he was saying is we built a mechanism to deal with this, specifically because we know that these other mechanisms can't handle it. Which is not to say that it's right. I'm not judging it as right or wrong. I'm just trying to maybe explain it a little.
Got it, okay. Are there other implications from the trade disputes that we're facing right now? Are there do we end up with national security issues because of this, Ambassador Zhou?
That's what we want to try to prevent. The disputes, the trade disputes from having negative impact on other parts of our relations. So we've been working hard to prevent that from happening. And I hope that would be the same attitude in Washington.
When you say working hard, what do you mean? Are there examples or?
I think the two sides are talking to one another about a possible meeting between the two presidents, because very soon they will go to G20. So I hope, at the moment, at the working level, staff at the level of staff, we're talking about it. So I hope there will be a meeting so that all these issues could be reviewed and discussed at the highest level.
Ambassador Baucus, you've addressed this a little bit at the beginning, but are you concerned that these trade disputes reach out to something that expand to something much larger in terms of national security issues between the two?
Well, yeah, I am. I mean, first the size, the magnitude. I don't know if President Trump's going to pull the trigger, but if the tariff goes up 20 to 25% and $250 billion worth of products the first of the year, he talks about another 200 on top of that. That's a big jolt.
So he talks about it all.
And that's a huge, and that's going to have huge repercussions in many, many areas, which are clearly going to bleed into national security and so forth. Frankly, I'm quite concerned because right now, CFIUS is being bolstered up to prevent.
Committee on Foreign Investment into the United States. This is the committee that decides whether or not a foreign company can buy a U.S. company.
It's limiting foreign investment in the United States, and they're tightening it up very significantly, and is aimed primarily at China. Washington, D.C. now is, it's in code blue, whatever it is. It's so upset with China right now, and it's DOD, the State Department of Defense, even more so. Huge influence on the investment process by the Department of Defense. Very worried about technology theft that's going to undermine the U.S. defense system. So it's an issue.
Yeah, there's no question. Trade is the canary in the coal mine here on national security concerns. The famous line of all of us who've studied trade theory: when goods don't cross borders, armies will. It clearly is the beginning of a real challenge. And it's a challenge for the United States, frankly, to think of, how do we contemplate our future security. What's the basis of our future security? And the challenge, I think, is to kind of keep this, in a sense, as an economic issue and begin to treat the security issues with security means. The mixing of economic means and security means becomes problematic. The larger strategic issue for the United States is, what's your perspective on what makes America great, so to speak, right? Is it having us be the center of a network of nations that are connected and share values and share economics and trading system? Or is it having us be the strongest kid in the block who kind of doesn't talk to the other kids except when it's time to kind of occasionally rattle them a little bit? Everything we think we know about economic theory suggests you want to be the center of a network system. You want your standards to be the most important standards in the world. You want your markets to be the most important markets in the world. And so deliberately severing those connections and undoing those markets, undoing those networks, is unlikely to be productive for your national security in the long run.
Can I have the cards? Thanks. Okay. Much of the discussion has focused on challenges. What broader areas of cooperation exist? Isn't the US-China relationship essential? You talked about this a little bit, the environment.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit more? Is there more to add?
Yeah. I think right now this sort of situation is not healthy, because all the existing channels have not been working. Because between China and the United States, there have been a number of mechanisms for cooperation, and so they have stopped working. So I think it's very important for the administration to recognize, we need to work hard, and both sides need to work very hard to keep this relationship remaining constructive, making sure that all the existing dialogue, the channel for dialogue sort of working. Right now, there's been no dialogue at the working level. This is a very dangerous situation. So United States very soon will have the largest military spending, totaling some $700 billion US. And you have military facilities all over the world. And so you are, during the previous session, you are worried about the port facility in Sri Lanka. So I think this is not a very healthy situation.
Are you suggesting it's slightly hypocritical for us to have a huge military and be all over the world, and therefore you guys should have the right to as well?
Because the size of your military spending would be would equal to the total amount of the next 10 countries after the United States. So that's a fact.
Areas of cooperation?
Yeah, cooperation. Well, we have cooperated. During my term over there, the one that impressed me the most was on climate change. When I first talked to President Xi and others about climate, it was like talking to a fence post. I got nowhere. Then over time, after a little glimmer of interest, yeah, gee, maybe there's something in this for China. They can be on the world stage with President Obama. That's a big deal. Second, work on renewable technologies, market them. That's a pretty big deal. And pretty soon, yeah, they reached that agreement, our two presidents, even though we've now pulled out of the Paris Accord. Still, that was a bright spot. Add to that is North Korea. I don't think there's any North Korea solution that does not go through China. China has to be part of the solution to North Korea. And if we have a good relationship with China, if we develop trust with China, then that's going to help us deal with North Korea. There are other areas too, but those are two big ones.
Yeah, I think that in addition to these areas, we are facing so many new technologies and ideas that we don't know how to regulate, right? And so in many of these emerging areas, artificial intelligence, biological engineering, we live in a global world where the intellectual capital is global, where the financial capital is global. And so the development and the use of these incredibly promising and simultaneously incredibly perilous technologies, how you regulate them, how you think about them, would be a great example of that. I happened to be in Beijing last week speaking with somebody who oversees a lot of the AI work there. And we got into a discussion which is, everybody's feeling like the world is in this race to develop AI, right? Who's the first country to be AI enabled? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be the United States? One of the lessons of the Industrial Revolution may be that you want to be the last country to have AI, that so many countries tried to develop industry and ended up in a disaster, Russia, China. And so I think these new technologies are an area. And I have to say, I think if you get back to the idea of getting trade on a more balanced footing, that the fundamental distributional principles of trade, that there are things China has that the United States needs, and there are things the United States has that China needs. And if those can be balanced in a way that is consistent with our larger national interests, which we should be able to find a way to do, then returning to having a prosperous, sensible economic relationship between the two sides is probably the single most important thing. And I think what's worrying about what's going on right now is that one of the things that determines if you have this Thucydides disaster or not is how much interdependence is there. And when you begin to have a set of policies that reduces the amount of interdependence, it increases the risk of a collision in the long run.
And if I might add right there on technology, with whether it's CFIUS or whatnot, there's a big concern about China technology being used the wrong way. There are a couple areas this is a bit naive, but I think it'd be helpful if we could go there. Some kind of international norms on technology, cyber. And let's take cyber. What are the standards? What's permissible? What's not permissible, et cetera? Because we don't have anything like that now. It's Wild West. And the same thing is true with respect to CFIUS. How do you trust another country's technology not to backdoor, in the government, et cetera? There are no standards. It's just again Wild West, and that's causing a lot of the problems.
Yeah, under President Obama, I was at the White House that day when he had the press conference with Xi Jinping, and basically said, okay, governments spy on each other, but government spying on the Dow 30 is another thing altogether and not acceptable, right? I mean, there's to come up with the framework, and it doesn't feel like we've gotten there yet. There was some progress, I thought, after President Obama.
There was some progress, and I want to dominate first over there, Lu Wei, who's now in jail. He was the head of the cybersecurity over there, and had a 2-hour conversation with him, trying to get him to agree just in principle there's a difference between spying for security purposes and spying for commercial purposes. He wouldn't agree to that. But after the opium hacking, we got them to agree, hey, it's a problem. They did send some people over, got a 5-point security agreement. It's okay, it's a start.
This is pretty provocative, this one, whoever did this. Over the past 2 decades, there have been a total of hundreds of thousands of Chinese students educated in the United States, including over 300,000 studying here right now. How will these future Chinese leaders drive China-US relations? How will they influence Chinese elite ideas about governance structures? Will democracy come to China?
I think that's a very important part of China's opening policy. And that policy will continue. That means, there will maybe more Chinese students would like to come this way to study, to pursue their sort of academic career. But will that be allowed to continue? So that's a real sort of question. And many have gone back and worked in different sort of positions, playing a very important role in increasing the exchanges between the two countries. So I think this is a very good and a positive part of our relationship.
They seem to suggest with the last question, will democracy come to China, that perhaps all of these Chinese students studying in the United States may carry back the idea that democracy would be a good idea in China.
I actually sort of answered this question in a way earlier. That is to say, China's opening, means China wants to learn whatever that is good for China from other countries. But what you have here, which is good for China, and China could have learned from you, needs to be implemented in Chinese specific Chinese conditions. So we cannot copy everything you have here.
You referenced this a little bit earlier, Ambassador Baucus, right? That they would become more like us. And is this person who poses this question, will democracy come to China because of all these Chinese students studying here, does that fall into that category?
Well, it's interesting. When I talk to Chinese students who come back from the United States, back over to China, they love it over here.
They love it here.
They love what they see in the United States. It's opened their eyes. And I asked, well, why? I said, well, it's your openness, your space, it's distance, it's freedom, it's democracy, and all that. That's what they tell me personally. It's very, very important. Now they're Chinese. They're proud to be Chinese. And so they'll approach all this from the Chinese perspective. Once I was walking down the streets of Chongqing, and there's an outdoor cafe, and stopped and just talked to people, and one thing or another, and asked about Taiwan. It's a whole other subject. And then I asked, when I say America, what comes to mind? And around the table, these are about 30-year-olds. They're drinking beer and all that kind of thing, this outdoor cafe. Openness, fairness, democracy. Around the table, yeah, they all agreed. Then I asked, well, will China ever be a democracy? Oh no, we'll just collapse. We cannot deal with democracy. Will China ever be a democracy? Oh yeah, maybe about 15, 20 years.
They think it'll collapse first?
Right now, they're right. If you impose democracy right now today, they'd be the end of it.
Okay.
But because there are no institutions. But after 15 years, 20 years, yeah, maybe.
Josh?
I think it gets to this. I'll end where I began, which is I think it is. You can't look at China at this point in time and think that is China. The dynamism, the energy of this younger generation. There's a famous line of Mao giving an address to graduates of the military academy in the 1950s, and he said, you have to worry about the future, and you are the future. Inevitably, you're the future, because we're not going to be here. And that energy of that generation, I think, is going to produce a lot of innovations, a lot of interesting ideas. And when you talk to people at the highest level of the Chinese political system, there is an awareness that the political system itself is a work in progress. It's an act of development, that everything is developing. And as Ambassador Zhou said, this willingness to sort of take ideas. So it's very hard to know where it's going to end up. It will certainly end up in something that reflects Chinese history and culture and traditions. But you have to argue, at the end of the day, the lesson of the last 40 years of history is a broader engagement with China. That willingness to educate these students here, to bring them here, has been a benefit to the United States more than it's been a hindrance. And I think on that basis, we ought to think about our future.
So my last question here, and since we've gotten to this point and we are at a university, it has been suggested that as part of this trade war with China, that maybe they stop giving visas to Chinese students to come here and study in the United States. It would certainly hit where it hurts, right, in terms of a tactic. You think it'll come to that?
It's very unfortunate that it's happening right now, and it's not only happening to students. It's happening to people in other sectors who plan to come here for different purposes.
So adults, business people.
Yeah, business people, even officials.
Okay.
Yeah, they are waiting for their visas, and so sometimes they have to give up their plan because of the visa issue.
So it's already underway.
I hope it would not happen, but we'll see.
Pastor Baucus.
Well, it is happening. The United States government, in my judgment, incorrectly is restricting visas for students and others that come to the United States. I think it's very reactive. It's wrong. If somebody, a Chinese person, comes to the United States and he or she may be a security risk, let's deal with that differently. Let's find out, but not willy-nilly tend to restrict visas to Chinese coming to America. We issued 300,000 a year student visas, 3 million tourist visas a year that come to the United States, and I think that's a big plus. Maybe some of them are spying. I'm sure some of them are. But let's just deal with that with our own judicial system, not stop them coming over.
Anything you have to say, Josh?
Yeah, it is responsive. If you believe that there's an argument that people make now that the great political debate in the world has moved from this left-right debate that characterized so many decades to open versus closed, right? And Brexit is a vote for closed. Trump and his wall are a vote for closed. These visa policies are a vote for closed. And so the really interesting question to ask yourself is, okay, let's say that shift has happened. What do we think the next generation of Americans want? Do they want closed or do they want open? As we move from a baby boomer age to a millennial age, what are those values? What are the global values? And I think it's very hard to handicap this. The acid test of all foreign policy is domestic politics. And if domestic politics is driven by a desire for the United States to close down, there's nothing any of us can say about that. The lesson of history is the United States has benefited enormously from openness. And by the way, I'd say, just to get back to the Thucydides trap question, the idea of the Thucydides trap is essentially this notion that every 100 years or so, you have a contest between great powers for leadership of the international system, right? So, the Dutch had leadership, and then the French wrested it away from them, and the Spanish got it from them, and then the British got it in the United States. We're just finishing our 100 years, and now somebody's going to come take it from us. That everybody gets about 100 years in power. But the reality is, if you look at all of human history, there are many examples of states that have led the international system for hundreds of years at a time. The Assyrians, the Moguls, the Qin dynasty, the Roman Empire, all of these, right? And that is the fundamental question for the United States, is are we at the end of our 100 years, and are we just fighting and to kind of keep our fingertips in which case maybe closing down is the right answer? Or do you believe that the United States has many centuries of prosperity and leadership ahead of it? And if you believe that, then the way in which you think about these problems of China or some percentage of university students doing things you didn't want them to do takes on a very different light.
Last question. You're only allowed to say one word. Control yourselves. I'm picking an arbitrary time frame. Five years from now, the relationship between China and the US is better or worse? Josh. Ambassador Baucus.
Better, because we have a new president.
Ambassador Zhou.
So it's a very difficult question because
when in doubt, compliment the moderator.
I hope it will get better. That's our hope. I think I really hope the administration would understand the importance of this relationship and to make the right decision and take the right approach.
Said one word, but I'll give you a pass. So that wraps up this panel. Guys, you were great, terrific, really tough discussion. Going to turn over the microphone to Michael Greenstone. He's going to help introduce the next panel. Thanks.
Thank you.